What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, because I've kind of reworked my schedule so that Monday, Wednesday, and Friday are our DC Rebirth days, which is to say those are the days where we're going to upload DC Rebirth videos, I was going through the playlist, which you'll find down in the description, and one of the things I noticed is that we haven't done a lot of stuff with DC Rebirth. Like, we've covered a lot of the really good stories, but in terms of going through and creating this kind of comprehensive, cohesive playlist of basically everything in Rebirth, there's a lot that we haven't done. There were even some of the Rebirth one-shot stories that we haven't done, like Superman, Justice League. So what we're going to do on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday is we're going to kind of like double up on DC Rebirth stuff. One of the videos will be the older, like when DC Rebirth first started, basically playing catch up. And the other ones will be the modern stories, the stories that are going on right now in Rebirth. So that way we kind of get the best of both worlds. But this story, A Lonely Place of Living, dude, this story is insane, man. Like this story is so good. Tynion is such an amazing writer when it comes to Batman. It's absolutely crazy. But this story serves a couple purposes. The first thing that I want you guys to bear in mind is this story takes place, at least this first little bit, takes place before the Oz effect, and then it takes place during the Oz effect. So it's actually kind of cool. You sort of get these two things going on at the same time. The other thing is that, of course, this does take place before Dark Knight's Metal, which is one of the reasons why we're going to see Bruce Wayne. Following that, actually, I think it takes place after Dark Knight's Metal because we have Tim Drake, who basically returns. This seems to be one of those stories where like Dark Knight's Metal takes place either like right at the time the story starts or like right before the story starts, but we haven't seen Tim Drake in Dark Knight's Metal, so we could just kind of just go by virtue of the evidence at hand that this takes place after the events of Dark Knight's Metal, which is a bit of a spoiler to a degree. It's again, Metal's kind of weird and is in terms of its placement and so on and so forth, but regardless, this basically sees the return of Tim Drake. But the other role this story plays is it's actually a prelude to the Super Sons of Tomorrow, which is an amazing story going on right now. Some classic DC characters are coming back in ways that I didn't think they would, and it's actually pretty solid. Now remember, Tim Drake had quote-unquote died during the first story arc of Detective Comics' Rise of the Batman, and the whole idea was that there was basically the father of Kate Kane, Batwoman, who had shown up at the the Belfry, basically the location of where the Bat family was operating out of, outside of the Batcave, and the overall goal of the colony, that organization that was led by Batwoman's father, was to basically invade the Batcave, invade all the Bat fortresses, take all the technology, and effectively militarize the Batman concept. The problem with this is, of course, while they were defeated, Tim Drake had kind of made this ultimate sacrifice, more or less, where it was believed that he had died. The problem was that he was whisked away by Mr. Oz, and he'd been held there ever since. And so up to this point, which is to say the time this story is being written right now, and maybe even the story beforehand, Bruce Wayne largely thought that Tim Drake was dead. Almost the entire Bat family thought that Tim Drake was dead. But because of the fact that DC Rebirth is the entry point for a lot of people when it comes to DC Comics, Tim Drake's origin is kind of retold here. It really comes as a series of questions from Mr. Oz. Now, of course, as we know from the Oz effect, which is a video that we've already done, we've already covered that story, Mr. Oz is the father of Superman. Now, of course, that's been confirmed both in the story as well as in the aftermath. So it's not like it was a red herring. That's definitively the case. But because of the fact that this takes place before the Oz effect story, meaning that Mr. Oz is still operating in his fortress and still has Tim Drake being held captive, this goes back to his early days. One of the things to keep in mind is the origin story of Tim Drake follows the death of Jason Todd. And the reason why was because when it came to Robin in DC Comics, of course, as we know, Dick Grayson was introduced to the Batman landscape for the sake of boosting sales, and it did that almost overnight. I mean, it was crazy how huge it was. And Dick Grayson remained Robin for almost 40 years. It wasn't until shortly before Crisis on Infinite Earths that he became Nightwing. He sort of stepped in and became his own hero, so on and so forth. Now, the idea behind this was that following Dick Grayson, you basically had the introduction of Jason Todd. Now, in the pre-Crisis landscape, Jason Todd was hated by most all the fans because his origin story was basically copy pasta. It was an exact duplicate of Dick Grayson's story. And fans' argument was, if you're going to give us a new character, don't copy the origin story of a previous character, make him somebody interesting. And so after Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC basically reworked the origin story of Jason, but he still wasn't wildly popular because the waters had already been tainted to a degree. And so they ended up killing him off. And in response to this, Batman became a lot darker, became a lot more ruthless in terms of how he conducted himself. The issue was that DC was kind of in this weird scenario in terms of the fact that there were a huge percentage of Dick Grayson fans that loved the idea of him being Nightwing, of him being his own superhero. But Robin was kind of part and parcel to the Batman mythos. And so the introduction of Tim Drake came by way of the fact that Tim just figured out that Robin was Dick Grayson and Bruce Wayne was Batman. And that was it. It was really cool in terms of like deductive logic. The idea was that DC was using this as a way to segue Tim Drake into the role of Robin, simply because of the fact that with Dick Grayson established as Nightwing, DC wasn't going to change that. So they kept Dick Grayson as Nightwing, even though Tim Drake went to him and said, look, Batman's more ruthless than he's ever been. He needs a Robin. You have to go back. Where Dick Grayson turned him down, Dick Grayson introduced Tim Drake to Batman. Batman took Tim Drake on as Robin, and he played that role for quite some time until he moved on to his own superhero to become Red Robin. So again, it's kind of a cool little origin that goes on there. And a lot of that's covered here in the first little bit. The problem with this is that, again, it's really more of just sort of Mr. Oz picking up the pieces, kind of figuring out what's going on. Because remember, because Mr. Oz is Jor-El, the father of Superman, who was yanked from the destruction of Krypton by Dr. Manhattan and then thrown on Earth, what this means is that in a lot of ways, Jor-El has catching up to do. He doesn't really know what was going on Earth, doesn't know a lot about the history of the characters. And so it's just as much about learning about the past as it is him taking Tim Drake for some ambiguous reason that was never fully explained. Now, of course, Tim Drake tries to engineer his escape, tries to get away. Mr. Oz immediately overpowers him, and that's really the end of that. This, of course, leads directly into the Oz effect with regards to what happens following this in Mr. Oz. But in the middle of all that, we also end up having this information being brought to us that Batman has effectively shown up to rescue Tim Drake. But the funny thing about this is that where Tim is initially happy to see Batman, once we end up having these doors more or less being let down, unlocked, what ends up happening here is Doomsday suddenly arrives. Now, the reason why this is so intriguing is because in the middle of all this, Batman pulls out guns. And as we know, Batman has a no-gun policy. Very rarely does he ever use guns. But this version of Batman basically says, look, I took the gun that killed my parents and I repurposed it and I'm using it now. And this immediately sets off to Tim Drake, this is not Bruce Wayne. And that's when Batman takes off his mask and says, no, I'm not Bruce Wayne. I'm Tim Drake from tomorrow, from the future. Now, this is really, really cool because on the surface, this offers the ability for DC to go into this really copy-pasta, formulaic method when it comes to time travel. And the reason why I say that is because usually when it comes to time travel stories, time travel is invoked whenever a writer puts themselves in a corner that they can't get out of. But what you're gonna notice here is that Tynion doesn't do that. Instead, he takes the standard on time travel in comics and flips it on its head. But from this whole encounter with Doomsday, one of the things that's immediately established is this future version of Tim can easily hold his own. Between his ingenuity, his fighting training, he's able to kind of work his way around Doomsday. But notice this, as one of the cool things here, we start seeing skill sets that Tim Drake doesn't normally have. And the reason why I say that is because for me, Tim Drake was never really on par with like Damian Wayne or Jason Todd or like Dick Grayson when it came to fighting. He comments on that in this comic. It says, look, I was never on their level when it came to like physical combat, but I was smarter than all of them. And so because of that, you know, where I'm not able to fight on the same way they are, I do know how to work around their fighting styles and still find ways to defeat them. And that's really kind of playing into the nature of Tim. Tim's always been one of the smartest members of the Bat family. Even if he's not the best fighter, he's certainly been like right up there when it comes to being some of the smartest guys. The other thing about this is that, you know, this future version of Tim starts spouting off talking about how things are going to start crashing down. But one of the other things that's established here is the nature of time itself. And this is why I say Tynion really kind of plays it pretty strict when it comes to the use of time travel. Now, in DC, time travel is in a lot of ways more strict than it is with Marvel. And a lot of that's because of the aftermath, the ramifications of the use of time travel. Because of the fact that the multiverse exists out there, you don't really see DC offer this explanation that the multiverse exists because something different happened in the modern day. And because of that action in the modern day, it spawned a different universe. Instead, it's just those universes are out there. Those alternate realities are there, but they're not really part and parcel. They're not really rooted to some action in the main DC universe. So time travel is basically one of those scenarios where a person goes back in time and it's really more of an explanation. It's really more of an offering in terms of here's the future that exists out there. Now it's up to you to try to find a way to change it. The other half of this is that future Tim Drake kind of goes on this explanation of everything that'll happen later on down the line. Not every single thing, but in terms of how it relates to Tim Drake. Because when the present day Tim asked the question, what could have possibly gone so bad? Future Tim basically says, look, a time will come when the Bat family will be betrayed, and it will come at the hands of Batwoman. But when that time comes, when Bruce Wayne effectively leaves the role of Batman, then the first person to take up the mantle is going to be Dick Grayson. But Dick Grayson's going to do what he always does. Dick Grayson was never destined to be Bruce Wayne because Dick Grayson doesn't view Batman the same way that Bruce Wayne does. Dick Grayson will play Batman for a while, then he'll move on. Red Hood will pick up the role for a while. He'll engage in a fight with some mystical ninjas. He'll basically end up losing a leg and he'll lose an eye. He'll basically step down from the mantle because of that and he'll lose his will to live, kind of just becoming a homeless derelict that exists out there somewhere. Following that, Damian Wayne will take up the role of Batman and he'll almost destroy the city of Gotham in the process because of how hardcore and ruthless he is. And so because everyone failed after Bruce left the mantle of Batman, it falls on the shoulders of Tim Drake. And Tim Drake just really kind of does the best he can, but the world's falling apart around him. You know, he really kind of lashes out and says, if there were any other option, I wouldn't be here in the first place. But I'm here because I have to be. I'm here because the future that I live in is horrible, and I'm trying to find a way to stop it from being that way. And so again, this is really more of him dealing with the present day version of Tim, because remember, one of the big plot points when it came to Tim himself was that he never really wanted to be be Batman. He wanted to go off and be his own superhero. He never saw himself taking up the mantle. But making their escape and getting out of the prison of Mr. Oz and back to Gotham City proper in the modern day, one of the things that ends up happening here is that future Tim says, look, my mission is done. I've got you back here. You need to go talk to Spoiler, but you also need to go talk to a guy named Connor Kent. Now, this is huge. This is massive because people who are fans of DC and have been reading for a long time know who Connor Kent is. Following the death of Superman, there were 4 new Supermen who rose up. There was the Metropolis Kid, there was John Henry Irons, also known as Steel, there was the Eradicator, and there was Cyborg. The only one we need to worry about is Connor Kent. Connor Kent is basically this kind of clone, combining the genes of Lex Luthor as well as Superman, kind of making him just like this perfect amalgamation of the two. But the whole idea behind this is that following the death of Superman, Connor Kent sort of went through this huge landscape of all these different roles that were played over the course of his character, but it was really more of a bit of soul searching. Once he learned about his origin, once Superman actually returned, he kind of went through this existential crisis where he was trying to figure out his place in the whole world. When DC Rebirth kicked off, we'd seen neither hide nor hair of Connor Kent, and a lot of people who were huge fans of him kept wondering where he was. One of the things here is that Tim Drake does not know who Connor Kent is. Now remember, this all feeds into the idea that Dr. Manhattan wiped 10 years from the minds of everyone, and so presumably for Tim Drake, this includes all knowledge of Connor Kent. So what this means is that Connor's out there, and we've seen him referenced before. Connor Kent exists in DC Rebirth. Because of the fact that Tim and Connor do have a history together, for future Tim Drake, the question is, why don't you know who Connor Kent is? And that's the huge question that goes on here, because what seems to be going on is because with future Tim existing, some 20, however many years into the future, the idea seems to be that things played out in this form, that you basically had Dr. Manhattan who showed up, he wiped 10 years from everybody's memory, and then all the events transpired in DC Rebirth, Doomsday Clock happened. And then presumably in Doomsday Clock, Dr. Manhattan restored everybody's memories so that future Tim Drake remembers Connor Kent, or he, ran into Connor Kent. But then again, this also plays into the idea that with this version of Tim Drake, his timeline's different. And so it may be that in the future that he comes from, Dr. Manhattan never wiped the minds of everybody for 10 years. A lot of those questions aren't really answered here. We're just kind of left to this bit of information. But because of the fact that he is, explicitly from the future of this universe, my original theory on Doomsday Clock and Manhattan fixing everything really seems to hold up. And the reason for that is because in order to test the waters here, future Tim cuts his younger self. And when he does, future Tim ends up with a scar on his arm that happens immediately. And so his recollection is, I can fix this timeline. I can make it so that my future never happens. And it's really, really interesting because it kind of plays on those stereotypical time-based concepts in the sense that somebody comes back from the future and they want to save the future or something along those lines. But the way this transpires is wildly intriguing because with present day Tim being knocked out, future Tim goes on this crusade with the intention of taking out Batwoman, since she will be the first step leading to his own future. Where he goes on the hunt for Batwoman, his present day self, present day Tim is just kind of knocked out by way of an electric shock, and then somebody presumably takes him to the hospital or at least calls an ambulance. But with his beacon effectively activating, Bruce Wayne's alerted by Alfred and immediately comes to the realization that Tim Drake is in Gotham City. He races to the hospital, grabs Tim, kind of holds him for a second, and then this basically breaks down into the whole scenario of what in the world is going on here. And so because it's the return of present day Tim, of course, most people are gathered. The only person you don't really see here is Spoiler. But present day Tim basically says, look, there's a future version of myself running around here, and his goal is to take out Batwoman. Now, this is where I say Tynion begins to break away from a lot of the traditional constructs when it comes to time travel. Because traditionally speaking, in really a lot of comics in general that use time travel, one of the things you'll see is that, future Tim is masquerading as present day Tim, and he's gonna betray everybody and trick everyone. That's not what happens. And it's actually a great reprieve because that would be so cliche. And that's what I love about Tynion's writing, is he doesn't really go for cliche things. Instead, you have present day Tim who just shows up in a hospital and Bruce Wayne rescues him, and then he comes back and he warns everybody about what's going on. But the other thing about this, and the reason why this is cool, is because it's basically James Tynion telling us, yeah, present day, Tim Drake is there, and it won't matter. This is designed to show how capable future Tim Drake becomes. But where Batwoman is kind of kept in this sort of stasis box for her own protection, present day Tim Drake kind of spills the beans on everything he's been told so far about the future version of himself, as well as everything he observed. And one of the things that he points out here is, look, this future version of myself was able to take on Doomsday by himself. If any of you fight him one-on-one, he will kill you, and he will not hesitate to do so because he genuinely believes that he's saving his future. And so what we end up doing is we basically have Bruce Wayne and present day Tim asking the question, if this future version of Tim is hunting around and he's trying to find Batwoman, he still has these subconscious processes that he's trying to satisfy, these urges that he needs to take care of. And the question is, where would be the first place he would go? Well, the answer is he would go to the first place that brings him comfort, the place that he calls home, Wayne Manor. And so initially he comes across, Alfred Pennyworth. Now, again, this really hits home to the allure of a lot of things that go on in the future. The idea that maybe Alfred died somewhere along the line and Tim Drake hasn't seen him for quite some time. But it is an interesting question here because Tim Drake asks, if I had to do something terrible in order to save my future, do you think I should do it? If Batwoman has to die in order to keep the rest of the Bat family together and to save the future, then she has to die. Classic utilitarianism. If Batwoman is truly the first domino that gets set in motion that knocks all these other dominoes down and it leads to this dark future that Tim Drake comes from, then it's logical that she should have to die. But that's assuming a linear timeline. That's assuming that if she dies, everything will be okay. But that's the nature of time. We learned about that from Flashpoint. We learned from Flashpoint, Barry Allen went into the past, saved his mom's life. That spawned this worse universe than the one that he lived in. It made sense that she had to die, that the mother of Barry Allen had to die in order for the regular universe to be preserved. And that's the nature of what goes on here, is that when you have Tim Drake basically met with the arrival of Damian Wayne, of Red Hood, of Dick Grayson, and Ace the Bat Hound to face off against Tim Drake, one of the things he says is, in this present day right now, I don't see myself on par with you guys, but I fought image holograms of you guys. I've basically learned all your strengths and all your weaknesses. And so it's important that you understand your place in the bigger picture. I care about you, but you're about to receive one of the most spectacular ass whippings in the history of your life. And that's exactly what happens. This fight breaks out in the entirety of Wayne Manor. You end up having Alfred Pennyworth come running downstairs. Man, guys, future Tim Drake is here. And he just wrecked Red Hood and Damian Wayne and Dick Grayson. So you guys need to be involved. And that's so cool, is because what this basically highlights is the idea that future Tim Drake is a one-man army. When this Bat family bands together for the intention of trying to take on Tim Drake, they just weren't prepared. That's exactly what happens. They were unaware of what was gonna happen. Not only that, Tim Drake basically says, look, you guys think you have a chance, but it's not just my fighting prowess. It's not just my intellect that's been improved over the years. I can also tap into the system that Batman's been working on. And where Batman is beginning the early processes of it, in my future, it's already completed. Not only that, I've mastered it, I've controlled it, and I use it through my suit. And when the question is asked what it is they're talking about, Bruce Wayne reveals the existence of Brother Eye. Now, Brother Eye is a huge deal when it comes to DC because Brother Eye is one of the coolest things out there. Now, Brother Eye was basically Batman's satellite system that was designed to monitor all metahumans, whether they were superheroes or villains or just, independent rogues that existed out there. But the idea with Brother Eye is Batman used it to monitor everything that was going on Earth. But with regards to this whole thing, one of the things to keep in mind here is that we've seen Brother Eye compromised. For example, during the events of Countdown to Infinite Crisis, one of the things we saw was the villain Maxwell Lord, who had taken control of Brother Eye. But remember, because of the fact that Dr. Manhattan wiped 10 years from everybody's mind, while Batman had created Brother Eye and Brother Eye had been compromised, on the surface, we would see him repeating the same mistake before. But Batman doesn't know he's doing that because those memories have been wiped from his mind by Dr. Manhattan. But regardless of how it turns out, the immediate effects of Tim Drake, from the future being in the modern day is felt when he basically has time kind of yanking against him. And that's the cool thing about this, is because where Marvel kind of experimented with the idea that time is not a fixed construct, time's a living organism, one of the cool things about this is that this hits at the idea that time constantly fights back, that there are fixed points, hurdles. You can't knock them over, you can't move them around, they're stuck there. You cannot actually change them. For example, Batman always exists, Superman always exists. These things are absolute constructs. Somewhere along the line, Batwoman will do something and it'll basically start bringing down the entire Bat family. What that thing is, we don't know, but it's cool because where, Tim Drake is trying to kind of stop this future from happening, what's basically taking place are two things at the same time. One, time is trying to yank him back to the future. It's trying to stop him from changing the past. At the same time, he's trying to change things that cannot be changed. But notice this, him taking out Batman feeds on the weakness of Batman. You know that being Batman's a curse. You know that being Batman is a terrible scenario. You don't want anybody else to be Batman, not because you want to keep the title to yourself, but because you know what it costs you. Feeding on that weakness of Bruce for a brief amount of time allows Tim Drake to get the upper hand and knock him out. It's feeding on the trust of Bruce. From there, he basically compromises the entirety of Brother Eye and controls it through his own suit. Travels over, basically has all these drones seek out Batwoman, try to take her out. It's a cool scenario and it's a cool thing because there's this massive conversation that happens between present day Tim and future Tim. And it's really interesting because it's basically future Tim saying, look, I'm making your life better. Batwoman is the one that sets this chain of events in motion that makes my future. Just let me take her out. When this is done, get back together with Spoiler. Go and have your life. Go live. And that's the cool thing about this is because it shines future Tim Drake in a new light. We could look at him as just kind of like some archetypical villain, right? Like he's going back into the past and he wants to take out Batwoman. That's kind of what we would expect from this, but it shines it in a new light because in his mind, he's saving the Bat family. Him giving words of advice to Tim Drake and saying, go live your life. It's amazing because he's genuinely trying to do the right thing. He genuinely believes he's a good guy here. Now, of course, this leads directly into the arrival of, all the other drones and the rest of the Bat family, so on and so forth, pursuing future Tim Drake. And they kind of fight, where they can, they take things out here and there. But it is cool because in the final moments of this battle, when future Tim realizes there's no way for him to succeed, that this is a fixed construct. In the end, it's not about stopping this event. It's about the choices that you make. And that's why I say this is basically designed to sort of explain, quote unquote, time travel in DC Comics. There are fixed things that always happen. These are absolute constructs. Things never change. The defining factor of what it is that led to present day Tim becoming future Tim were the choices that he made along the way. And that's the significance of this all. That's why it all matters so much, is because there's no way to stop Batwoman from making her decision. There's no way to stop her from betraying the Bat family. What defines future Tim is how he reacted to it. And that's the last piece of advice that he gives to his present day self. I finally realize what's going on. Batwoman will betray the Bat family. But when that happens, make the right calls. Make the right decisions. Do not become me. And so the result is that he's basically yanked back to his future, and we're just kind of left with Tim Drake trying to figure out what the next step should be and how to deal with the idea that Batwoman is going to betray the Bat family, that she's going to do something that's going to set in motion the future of himself some 20 years later on down the line. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Definitely one of my favorite stories so far. Absolutely love this. It's pretty amazing. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.